Hello, this is Alan Wheeler, your instructor for English 1102 online literature. This is the first lecture I'm recording to put on Angel for you, and in each of these I hope to take a short time, maybe 5, 10, or 15 minutes for each one, and look at a single work and approach it from one angle, one aspect or element that you could use to interpret other works. For example, today I'll talk about The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin, using background information to help understand the story. Well, you could use this principle of studying background information to help you understand any work of literature. So this is something that you could apply in your own studies later. But for now, let's look at The Story of an Hour and let the background information help us gain some insight. First of all, if you looked at the reading guide, you already have thought about how the time period may help us understand the story. Here was the question from the reading guide. Number 1, when does this story take place? Why is that important for our understanding of the story? And certainly if you read it in the textbook, you saw the date there, that it was published in 1898. Certainly you noticed, if you read more than just a few lines, things like the telegraph and the travel by train were obviously in a different time period. But probably more pertinent to the theme or the significance of the story was the institution of marriage that Chopin depicted for us. And the roles of the husband and wife were more traditional at that time. Probably the woman was more captive in the home, which may have accounted for some of the feelings of Mrs. Mallard, and probably with fewer rights at that time. So some have looked at her works as works of feminism and concerned with the role and the rights of women. And so that certainly helps us understand the story. Also, we know that from studying the time period that critics and readers were more conservative and reacted more strongly to her work. In fact, she wasn't well remembered until she was basically rediscovered in the 1950s. And so in her own time, she was not appreciated. In fact, many critics and readers were shocked or outraged, particularly at her novel, The Awakening. And your textbook describes that here, that when it appeared in 1899, critics were outraged by her candid portrait of a woman who seeks sexual and professional independence. So, of course, in our own time, that's much more common, but this caused a literary scandal in her day. And so, again, the time period helps us to understand the significance of the story. Now, something else to be considered as background information is the author's own life. And while it might not always help illuminate a text, there are times when it will. And we know that Kate Chopin was raised by her mother's family because her father died when she was young. We also know, just from the brief biography in your textbook, that her husband died suddenly when he was a young man, leaving her with 6 children to raise. and perhaps plunging her into her writing career. These things may give us insight into her work. Also, we know that in her, particularly in her short stories, that Kate Chopin often wrote about other cultures: Creole, Cajun, Black, Indian. She certainly wrote about women with care and sensitivity. So she was raised in Louisiana and became aware of those cultures and receptive to a variety of people groups and types of people. So we can see how her life entered her creative writing. Something else that may give us some insight was that we know that she read fine woman writers of her day and was admired them, perhaps was influenced by them, and some of them realists. For example, Sarah Orne Jewett, the main realist. We know that Kate Chopin read Zola and other new and scandalous French naturalist writers. So this takes us to a third realm to consider beyond the time period and her own life, and that is the literary influences that may give us some insight. And we know that in her time, realism was a very influential literary movement. And so realism seeks to depict life, represent life the way it actually is, the way life actually is lived, to recount the surface details of life, and whether psychologically or the surface, to depict the true nature of life, and not a romantic picture or an idealistic picture or a sentimental picture. So certainly we can see in this story we don't get a sentimental picture of love and marriage or an idealistic one, but whether it rings true to us or not, at least we can assume that Kate Chopin is trying to depict the reality of human emotions and the reality of human social life. Going even beyond realism, though, we know that there's an element, at least, of naturalism. And naturalism is sometimes called a harsher form of realism. In fact, it's a little more philosophical than realism. It's in its simplest sense, we can say naturalism is the application of principles of something called scientific determinism to literature. And scientific determinism assumes that there are observable causes that can be studied that determine how life, that determine reality, basically. And so, for example, Freud said that human behavior was determined by subconscious drives and motivations and impulses. Newton, of course, studied forces of physics that and the cause and effect of scientific principles that determined outcomes in the real world. And so for these naturalist writers, they were forces of biology, socioeconomic forces that drove people to do the things that they do. And so the characters in these stories are often controlled and compelled by things beyond themselves. There's a famous example in a novel by Theodore Dreiser who was an American naturalist. His novel was called Sister Carrie, and the main character, Carrie, at one point was compared to a straw, just a piece of straw blown on the wind here and there. And her life, she had no control over her own life, but these forces of society and nature drove her to her destiny. So, knowing this, understanding the movements of realism and naturalism can help us understand the story. As we see in the beginning of The Story of an Hour, Mrs. Mallard has a heart condition, and that foreshadows the ending of the story and determines perhaps the ending of the story. We see the social forces at play and see the results of those. So this is the third realm of background information, the literary background, the literary influences that can help us understand the work. So I encourage you, even if it's just reading the introduction to the stories, finding out the conventions of the genre that is being written or the literary movement that may be influencing it, knowing something of the time period that may help understand the theme or significance of the story. I encourage you to do that as we continue through the course. I hope that was helpful. I hope that made sense, and thank you for listening.